everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone is doing well, and welcome to those of you who are joining us by live stream. I was just talking about my new air fryer, which has nothing to do with anything except I'm very excited about my new air fryer. And I also am excited about Dollar Tree because I've just, like, everything in there is $1. And so I just went and got like 10 pairs of reading glasses and one for every room in the house. And so welcome, everyone. Just wanted to throw that in. These are things that are on my mind as we begin tonight. So I'm going to get focused now, and we will study the Bible together. But we really are glad that you're here and glad that you're there wherever you are watching us from. And tonight we're continuing our series of lessons that we're calling New Testament lessons from Old Testament prophets. We've looked at lessons from the prophecy of Jeremiah and the prophecy of Ezekiel. And tonight we're going to be looking at a passage from the prophecy of Daniel. And we're going to be specifically looking at Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 25. But I'm going to try to set some context for interpreting this passage. And I will say that some of what I'm going to say is debated among scholars, and so you might have a different view or might find different views, but I'm going to tell you what my view is about the background of Daniel. So we've been spending a lot of time in the last several weeks talking about the Babylonian exile, which is when Jeremiah and Ezekiel did their prophecy. And I'm not going to spend any time really at all reminding you of the background of the Babylonian exile, except just to say that the Babylonians controlled the area of Palestine from 587 to 539 BC. At the end of the Babylonian period, the Persian Empire began to control Palestine, and in 539 BC, Cyrus of Persia issued a decree permitting the exiled people to return from Babylon to Palestine. But it was during that Babylonian period of time that the person, Daniel, was lived, and the experiences that we're going to be talking about tonight took place. So the setting of the story is during the Babylonian exile. As I said, the Babylonians were replaced by the Persians, who ruled from 539 to around 350 BC. And then the Persian Empire was overtaken by the Greek Empire. Sometime around 350 BC, the Persian Empire began to weaken, and Philip of Macedon began to unite many of the Persian city-states in the area of Greece and Macedonia. During the reign of Darius III, Philip of Macedon was assassinated, but the Greek Empire continued to emerge under the leadership of Philip's son, someone you may have heard of, Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great reigned for only 10 years, but he's called Alexander the Great because in that 10-year period of time, he instituted so many sweeping changes that affected the people in Palestine and really the people in that part of the world for centuries to come. Alexander the Great united the empire around the Greek language and the Greek culture. His policies and influence would be felt for years to come, certainly throughout the end of the New Testament period. So from that point on through the end of our Bible, Alexander the Great's influence can be seen in the Greek language and the Greek culture. He made Greek the universal language. He required that it be taught in school. He pushed Greek philosophy since he studied under Aristotle himself. He pushed Greek culture and art and customs and literature, and over a relatively short period of time, thoroughly immersed the culture in the Greek way of life. When he died in 323, the empire was divided among 4 of his generals, and 2 of them was a guy named Ptolemy, and his successors or followers came to be known as the Ptolemies, and Seleucus, and his followers came to be known as the Seleucids. Ptolemy ruled Palestine and Egypt, and for a period of time, he allowed considerable freedom to the Jews. So the Jews who lived in Palestine during this time had relative freedom to practice their religion as they saw fit to. But Seleucus, who had control of Syria, eventually gained more influence. And Palestine was caught as a buffer zone between Egypt to the south and Syria to the north. And so Seleucus, when he took over control of the Palestinian region, began to impose Greek culture and began to persecute Jews who would not practice the Greek way of life. And by 200, this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth was the Seleucid leader. And the word Epiphanes, from which he gets his name, of course, means revelation of God. So you can see how highly he thought of himself. And so Antiochus Epiphanes interfered for the very first time in the selection of the Jewish high priest, and in effect sold the position of high priest to the highest bidder. And so for the first time in really since the days of Aaron, the high priesthood was turned into a political office rather than a religious office. And more importantly, he forbade Jewish religious practices, including circumcision. So not only did he impose the Greek way of life, but he also forbade certain Jewish practices that were central and essential to the Jews' practice of their faith. But the abomination of desolation, as it was called, the worst thing imaginable, was when he set up an altar to a Greek god, Zeus, in the temple, in the rebuilt temple. And he ordered all the Jews to sacrifice to Zeus in the Lord's temple. And then, to add insult to injury, he sacrificed a pig, which was considered to be the most unclean of all animals to the Jews. He sacrificed a pig on the sacred altar in the Holy of Holies. And that act came to be known as the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege, as it is sometimes called. Well, when he did that prompted a revolt among the Jewish people, as you can imagine. I mean, can you imagine somebody coming in here and constructing some kind of altar in here to some kind of foreign god and sacrificing an unclean animal? Just imagine how this would have incensed and offended the Jews. And they were being required to worship a false god, the Greek god Zeus, instead of Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac. And so the Maccabean revolt took place. when the conservative Jews, who comprised the majority, revolted in 168 under the leadership of a guy named Mattathias and his 5 sons, the most famous of whom was Judas Maccabeus. You may have heard of him. And their method, the Jews had no organized military. Their method was guerrilla warfare. Just, you see a Greek person, you just sneak up on them and kill them. But there was no organized military effort. They just had untrained armies. They had unsophisticated weaponry. But their revolt, miraculously, was successful. And so after about 3 years of civil war, from 167 to 164 BC, after just about 3 years of civil war, the Seleucids in Jerusalem were defeated. It was an amazing feat, an incredible victory. And so in December of 164, on December the 25th, 164, the temple was ritually cleansed and rededicated to the Lord on the anniversary of the abomination of desolation. And that celebration became known as Hanukkah. And of course, Jews have been practicing and celebrating Hanukkah ever since December 25th of 164. So for the first and last time in many centuries, the Jews had gained their independence, and Judas Maccabeus and his descendants founded a dynasty that ruled Palestine until the Roman Empire took over in 63 BC. And of course, the Roman Empire dominated throughout the end of the New Testament period. Now, I'm telling you all that because I feel like not everybody's interested in all this. But I'm telling you all that because many scholars believe that the book that we now call Daniel was not written during this time frame. It was written during this time frame about a person who lived in this time frame. And what the prophecy of Daniel shows us is a parallel situation between what was going on in the 2nd century when Jews were being persecuted and were being forced to bow down to a false god and were being persecuted if they remained faithful to God. The same thing that this guy named Daniel was facing during the Babylonian period. So with that background, I want you to turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 1, and just read the opening verses, and hopefully maybe some of this will matter to you a little bit more. So Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. That would have been somewhere around 587 BC. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, handsome and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to serve in the king's palace, and to teach them the letters and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the rich food which the king ate and of the wine which he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel and so forth. But look at verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's rich food. So here we see the storyline being set up for us. The book of Daniel contains 6 stories and 4 dream/visions. And the dreams and the visions comprise the first really great apocalyptic work, apocalyptic piece of literature, which became popular in the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's another reason why scholars believe that Daniel was actually written in this period of time when all of this apocalyptic literature started flourishing. And there were other later apocalyptic works written about that same time, like First Enoch and Syriac Baruch, and then later the New Testament book of Revelation, which is called the Apocalypse or the Revelation. And these apocalypses came from a period of national or community tribulation, and they use all of these symbolic symbols. I guess all symbols are symbolic. Signs and symbols to interpret current history and predict a future in which tribulations and sorrows will be replaced by triumph and grace. So that's the theme of these apocalyptic works. They come out of a period of persecution and then show how God is going to redeem the situation. And that's really the message of Revelation when you think about it. That there's going to be this end of the age in which God's people are going to be persecuted, but God is going to make things right again. Well, so to encourage fellow believers in this period of time, someone compiled these stories about Daniel from a previous time, compiled these 6 stories and these 4 dreams under Daniel's name, and presented these stories and visions as a way to show that just as Daniel remained faithful in times of persecution, that these people going through this persecution in the 2nd century BC should remain faithful too, because God was going to take care of them. It's basically the message of the book. Now, the first story that I just set up in chapter 1, verses 1 through 21 is about Daniel and his friends who were rewarded for their faithful observance of the law, specifically refusing to eat food forbidden by Jewish dietary laws. So they were forbidden, they were rewarded for not eating the unclean food. So Daniel remains true to his faith and true to his religion and refuses to eat the food that he was commanded to eat. The second story is found in chapter 2, and it's a story about the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. And it's a story that teaches the feebleness of human wisdom compared to the wisdom that is conferred by God. The third story is the story we're going to focus on tonight, and I know you're glad that we now are through with the background and are at the actual passage. So the third story is about 3 young people who are popularly known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You've heard those names. There are all kinds of songs about them. There's some dances about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But it's a story about these 3 young people who refused to bow down and worship the gold image Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And those who refused to bow down and worship the gold image would be cast into a burning, fiery furnace that was kind of like a kiln. I don't know how to say that word real well. Kiln, is that the right way to say it? Kiln? You know what that is? Somebody say that word. Did I say it right? Okay, all right. I have it on good authority. And so it's like this giant kiln that had an opening at the top and an opening at the ground level. And we know from other references, like from Genesis 38 and from Joshua chapter 7, that punishment by burning alive was not uncommon. So it was not uncommon as a punishment for people to be thrown into a fiery pit like this. So that's kind of sets the stage for the passage. And now let's read the passage itself. It's this Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 25. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. I'm going to stop there. So, to me, it's one of the most striking verses in the whole passage, and in some ways is even more important than what happened later. That they refused to bow down and worship the golden image. And then when the king confronted them with their disobedience, they said to him, we do not need to defend ourselves. Have you ever been around people who are very defensive? A lot of times, defensiveness shows a lack of security, a lack of confidence. And so somebody says something to you that might hint at being critical, and before you know it, you feel yourself tensing up, and then before you know what you're saying, you're starting to defend yourself. But do you know people who have been attacked and confronted and did not feel the need to defend themselves? They were just so sure that they were right. They were just content to let people think whatever they wanted to think. One of the most glaring illustrations of that is in the Gospel of John, chapter 19. You might remember this scene. It's a really dramatic scene in John's Gospel where Pilate confronts Jesus. And Pilate says to Jesus, do you not realize that I have the power to set you free or put you to death? Answer me. And Pilate was asking Jesus questions, and Jesus didn't respond. Now, Jesus obviously had done nothing wrong, and he was being falsely charged. These were trumped up charges. Unlike Daniel and his friends who had done what they were accused of doing, Jesus had not done what he was accused of doing. And he had every reason to defend himself from a human standpoint. And so Pilate says to him, don't you realize that I have the power to let you go or kill you? And finally, Jesus said to Pilate, you don't have any power over me at all. And the power you think you have has been given to you by God. You are just a pawn in God's plan, and you don't have sense enough to know it. Now, that's my paraphrase of it. But basically, Jesus was saying, you don't have ultimate power over me. There is a power higher than you. And essentially, that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saying to Nebuchadnezzar. You don't have power over us. We don't owe you an explanation for not bowing down to your God. That speaks to me of security and confidence and faithfulness, even in the midst of potential persecution. I read a book when I was in seminary back in the late 1800s that really changed the way I think of life and think of the Christian faith. it transformed me in a lot of ways. And it's a book called Stages of Faith by James Fowler. And in that book, Fowler suggests, he had spent his life researching how faith develops in people. And he said that there are various stages of faith. And the first stage of faith is just kind of a elementary kind of faith, you know, the faith that you have as a child. And then hopefully as your faith matures, you move from those elemental kind of faith constructs to a more mature faith construct. And you move through certain stages. And he says, he identifies that there are 6 of these stages. And he says that the 6th stage is a stage that he said very, very few people ever reach. He mentions a couple of historical figures that he thought may have achieved that stage of faith. You know, somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer or somebody like that. And he said the 6th and final stage is when a person is so faithful that he or she no longer has to survive. That a person no longer clings to life, no longer is desperate to survive, but is free to die. And he goes on to say that only people who are free to die are really free to live the way God intended for us to live. I'm not close to that 6th stage. But the point is that there are people, and we're about to see an example of it. Certainly Jesus was the premier example of this. But there are people in life who are so faithful to God, they don't have to survive anymore. So, you know, I'm sure Pilate must have thought when Jesus said, "You don't have any power over me." I'm sure Pilate must have thought, well, what do you do with somebody like that? I mean, all you can do is kill them, and they're okay with that. That's what you have to do. So what kind of threat can you hold over somebody like that? Somebody who is free to die. And Jesus said, nobody takes my life. I lay it down. I'm free to die. And only those who are free to die are free to live. Fully live as God intends for us to live. Just think about all the energy we put into trying to survive. Now, I'm not saying that we should have some kind of death wish and try to die, but I am saying that people who are secure enough in their faith really are free to die. Death has no threat over them anymore. So that's what I'm hearing Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego saying. We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. We've done what we know we needed to do, and then you have to do what you think you have to do. Verse 17. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. Imagine the faith of that statement. You know, they're getting ready to be thrown into a fiery furnace, and they're saying, you know, if we're thrown in this blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And then I love the next verse. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we still will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. That to me is the perfect balance and tension of faith. That we believe in a God who can rescue us from a fiery furnace, and we believe in God when he doesn't rescue us from a fiery furnace. We're free to live, we're free to die. We believe God is able to deliver us, but we also will believe in God if God does not deliver us, because what awaits us beyond this fiery furnace is still far better than anything we can have in this life. God is able, but even if God chooses not to deliver us for whatever reason, we will remain faithful.
Just to follow that, Stephen, I'm wondering at this time, with there being a lack of a developed view of life after death, if maybe they were saying, without hope after death, we're not in this life.
Yeah.
Going to deny our God.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's entirely possible. We don't know what they would have believed about life after death. But they're saying there are some things worse than death. And what would be worse than death would be renouncing our faith in God. I shrink before these verses. I just shrink. Now, I want us to pause at this point and turn to Hebrews chapter 11. So, of course, Hebrews chapter 11 is sometimes called the roll call of faith. It begins with a textbook definition of faith in chapter 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That is what faith is. It's the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's the definition. And then throughout the chapter 11, he starts to give, as any good preacher would do, sermons illustrations of faith. This is what it means to have the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. He starts with Abel, starting in verse 4, and then moves on through to Noah in verse 7, and Abraham in verse 8. He continues with Abraham in verse 17, with Moses in verse 23. In verse 29, he includes Rahab. And then beginning in verse 32, you get the feeling that he is saying, just like everybody thinks of Hebrews as a sermon more than a letter anyway. So, you know how preachers get, they give some sermon illustrations. It's almost like they look at the clock and they say, I don't have time to finish this. How many times have you heard that, Like, I don't have time to finish this. But you get the feeling that the preacher in Hebrews is getting to that point where he starts listing all these examples of faith. And then he says in verse 32, realizing he couldn't possibly list all the faithful people in the Old Testament. So then he says, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, David and Samuel and the prophets. And then watch this in verse 33. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received their dead by resurrection. And so stop there. And so he's listing all of these successful experiences that people had, that people showed faith and they were rewarded for their faith. And they had amazing and miraculous outcomes from their faith. And you think, boy, that's faith. Now look what happens next. At the end of verse 35. But some were tortured, refusing to accept release that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. And that's a reference to the tradition that the prophet Isaiah was sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. So do you see what he's doing here? He's saying some of these faithful people had amazing, miraculous outcomes. Others who were just as faithful ended up getting killed for their faith. You can't predict an outcome based on how faithful you are. You can't assume that just because you're faithful that you're going to have a miraculous, amazing outcome. You might end up with being persecuted or mistreated or abused or whatever. And of course, the supreme example of that is Jesus, who remained faithful unto death, even the death on a criminal's cross. So faithfulness does not guarantee reward. And this passage proves that. But what I want you to see before we get back to Daniel, is verses 39 and 40. And all these people, though well attested by their faith, did not receive what was promised. Did not receive what was promised in their lifetime. Because God had foreseen something better for us. That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In this passage, the writer of Hebrews is saying that we are in a long line of faithful people. And we, all these centuries later, have benefited from their faithfulness. Because by their faithfulness, the gospel message has been preserved and has been passed along. Because people were willing to live for this and die for this, we are the recipients of their faithfulness. We benefit from their faithfulness. And they died without seeing the promise completely fulfilled. And we are going to die without seeing the promise completely fulfilled. All these generations had lived and died without seeing how the whole story was going to end up. But we are in the line of that story. And we are the recipients and the benefactors of their faithfulness. Okay, so now we're back to Daniel. Verse 19. This is after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had said, God is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down to your God. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Notice how they're setting this up in such a way that there is no way these guys could survive. They're not just throwing them into a furnace that's going to singe them. They're putting them in this furnace that is 7 times hotter than usual. And then they're making sure, so they can't escape, that the strongest soldiers tie them up and throw them into this blazing furnace. Verse 21. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the soldiers who had to get close enough to this hot furnace to throw the guys in there got killed just from the heat emanating from the furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, hey, wait a minute. Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? And they replied, certainly, your majesty. And he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods, which would have been his only way of describing what he was seeing. So, when the 3 youths refused the king's orders, the king was furious. He ordered the furnace to be heated. The youths were cast into the furnace. And then the king looked in and he saw 4 men, not 3. The 4 men were not just in there, but they were walking loose. They had been bound, but they were unbound in the furnace. And they were in the fire, but the fire was not consuming them. And he saw that the mysterious 4th man looked like a son of the gods, or some kind of, in his mind, some kind of celestial being. And in verse 28, which is just beyond the passage we just read, Nebuchadnezzar said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel. Here Nebuchadnezzar is calling this 4th one an angel. So the king came near. He called the men to come out. Imagine that, that he calls these men who've been walking around in a fiery furnace to walk out, and they did. And the king saw that not only did they survive it, but they were unharmed by the fire. The hair on their head was not even singed. I love the way this story is told to emphasize the details. And there was not even the stench or smell of fire on them. They didn't have the fiery smell to them. So the king issued a decree that anyone who spoke against the God of these 3 men would be destroyed. I mean, this made a believer out of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he was respectful and reverent of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. He didn't know all there was to know about that God any more than we do, but this made a believer out of him. So what I want you to do is to think about, remember the theme of this is New Testament lessons from Old Testament prophecies. The first New Testament lesson that I see from this is that martyrdom is better than apostasy. Apostasy means a denial of our faith. Martyrdom is to die for your faith. It's better to die for your faith than to deny your faith. That there are some things worse than death. And the supreme example of that is Jesus himself. That Jesus was free to die, and he would rather die than to cave in to the demands placed upon him. The second New Testament lesson that I learned from this Old Testament prophet is that the kingdom of heaven belongs to people who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. If you turn to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, in the opening, the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount, is the section that we usually refer to as the Beatitudes. And the last two of these Beatitudes, and New Testament interpreters believe really that the second one is an extension of the first, begins with in verse 10. Blessed, this is Jesus, of course, speaking. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, there are some people who are persecuted not for righteousness' sake. They're persecuted because they're obnoxious, or they're persecuted because they're jerks, or whatever. So just to be persecuted by itself is no virtue. But to be persecuted for righteousness' sake, Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted for doing what is right, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And this could be a veiled reference to people like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, beginning with verse 11. Excuse me. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so people persecuted the prophets who were before you. A veiled reference to people like Daniel and other prophets who were persecuted for righteousness' sake. That God takes note of people who are persecuted for righteous reasons. And then the third New Testament lesson that we learn from this Old Testament prophet that I see is that when we walk through fiery trials, no pun intended, we do not walk alone. But there is another walking with us. There are three people who were thrown into this furnace, but there were 4 people in the furnace. That God's representative presence was there with them. I want to close by reading from the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 43, verses 1 and 2. One of my most favorite Old Testament passages. And I read it tonight, I think you will see, for obvious reasons as it relates to the story we just read from Daniel. Isaiah 43, beginning with verse 1. And this was written during the period of time when Daniel lived. But now thus says the Lord, He who created you, O Jacob, He who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. And when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you, because I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior, because you are precious in my eyes, and I love you. Fear not, for I am with you. So whatever it is that you're going through, whatever kind of fiery trial, whatever kind of raging waters you're walking through, the Old Testament gives us this New Testament lesson that you are not walking through that alone. That the God who loves you and has redeemed you and has called you by name is walking with you. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. God, we thank you for this timely reminder that whatever we go through in life, when we are faithful to you, you are walking through it with us. We are never alone. Help us to remain true to you and faithful to you, whatever the cost might be. And help us to live as those who are prepared to die, so that we may die as those who are prepared to live. Help us, Lord, to be ready to die so that we will be ready to live, fully live as you created and called us to live. In Jesus' name we pray.